So I'm going to let Billy get to work. Billy Richardson.
Good afternoon. James is kind of right. The Subaru was definitely a draw, but it really was the fly fishing that took me to Montana. And the professors who initially trained me in the processes he's talking about. It was very, it's actually what drew me out to Montana, the database decision making that we're going to talk about. My career started as a school psychologist. I worked for 6+ years with the public school system, doing psychological evaluations for special ed eligibility, writing IEPs, and then running response to intervention teams and helping teams make database decisions. And that's where my experience began. The last 2.5 years since we have lived in Birmingham, I've been in private practice, training teachers in applied behavior analysis, writing behavior plans, doing independent evaluations, and helping schools set up and monitor students' progress using database decision making. I've taken a school-based process and learned it as a school psychologist and have been able to apply it to the private practice and help push it in that way. At Behavioral One, we're trying to do use database decision making to provide a comprehensive range of assessment services to meet children and adolescents' needs. At the same time, we're trying to use multiple disciplines and fields to provide treatment for these kids, and then also support for the family. And when I say support, I mean academic tutoring for siblings and peers, I mean family counseling, educational consultation, behavioral consultation, and those types of things. To do this, we've developed our philosophy, which is we believe that children are most successful and likely to make meaningful progress when all services and service providers work together. Open and frequent communication between service providers is essential to continuous growth and success of the child. Effective collaboration among team members leads to better services and outcomes for children and their families. That is our philosophy at Behavioral One. We're trying to take a ton of services and a ton of resources to meet these child's needs. And to do that, we have to communicate effectively. When I say consultation and collaboration, I mean continuous, effective, and the entire team. And this can be applied at the public school level as well as the private field here. When I say entire team, that includes the parents and all service providers and teachers and people who know the child. And when I say effective, I mean data-based, okay? So based on my training and my experience, I'm going to focus the rest of what we're going to talk about today on database decision making, okay? And there's a lot to go into it, that goes into it, but I'm going to try to simplify it down to an idea and a philosophy that you could then take as a parent or an educator and try to apply it to individual children. If you Google database decision making, you could come up with hundreds and hundreds of charts and graphs like this to describe database decision making. Some of them have 10, 20, 30 bubbles in them. Some of them have a few. I really like this one for several reasons. It breaks it down into 4 main steps. It's very concrete, okay? And it's also a business type model. That makes it very, very concrete and very systematic, okay? And we're going to walk through each one of these, and I'm going to talk about the different aspects, and then we'll talk about the keys to making database decisions, okay? The first step in database decision making is gathering data, okay? Oftentimes we already have a ton of data. We have data on our client, our student, our child. We also have data on the services that we provide as a school district, okay? And you see outcome data there? We'll get back to it because this is a loop, okay? And when we look at our data and we collect our data, we're identifying our problem, an initial identification of our problem, right? And when we identify that problem, if we realize that we don't have data for that problem to help identify it, then we go out and collect it, okay? And I'm going to kind of walk through one example here There are a multitude of examples, but I'm going to walk through one throughout this whole process. So let's say I have a middle school teacher come to me and say, this student, or I'm brought in as an independent evaluator because a student is struggling in math, pre-algebra, okay? And that's the problem that they have identified. We're failing math, okay? There's a lot that could go into why a student is failing pre-algebra math. But we're going to look at the data that we have, okay? And we're going to try to narrow down exactly what that problem is to make it as specific as possible, okay? And that's where we get to the second step. We're going to interpret our data, okay? So as we interpret this data, we're going to graph it, and we're going to redefine our problem. Okay, so my initial problem, let's say, was he's struggling in algebra or pre-algebra in math. We looked at grades, we looked at attendance, we looked at the materials the student was using, or the teacher was using to teach the student, and we decided we needed more data. So we went and collected more data, and what I would typically do is screen the student in all pre-math skills, all right, to see if there is a more specific problem that can be defined, all right? Now, when we're talking simple data here. We're talking a fluency data or probe data that takes minutes, 2 minutes to administer to try and pick apart the skills that a student doesn't understand or isn't completing effectively. Is everybody with me so far? And I'm flying through it because I really want you to understand the steps and then brainstorm ideas on how to implement these steps in your own practice. All right. The next thing that we do is develop an action plan. All right, so we've collected our data, and we've redefined our problem. So for the math example that I gave, teacher came, he's failing algebra, so we screened him with, let's say, first, second grade, third grade, fourth grade math skills, and identified that we were really struggling with multiplication and division. All right, so we've narrowed down our problem, and we're not just failing algebra, we have a deficit in pre-algebra skills or pre-math skills, all right? So at this point, we're going to develop an action plan around that skill deficit, all right? We're going to set goals, we're going to set objectives, and we're going to develop a process. And what's really important with your action plan, which is one place that I really help schools, is to evaluate their resources. What do you have? What evidence-based curriculums do you have? What personnel do you have to provide additional services? How is your classroom set up? What sort of things do you have to collect data? Do you already have a system to collect data, or do we need to create one to collect data? And as part of the action plan, you always need to set a data collection procedure, because we have our initial data, but throughout this, we're going to continue to collect data to monitor our progress, okay? After you make your action plan, that's where you enact your change, all right? I always stress evidence-based strategies, evidence-based interventions, okay? So say we have a deficit from our original problem, math and math facts, multiplication, division. We might look at the evidence base and what curriculums we could utilize, okay? Our plan might be as simple to include 15 extra minutes a day directed at multiplication facts. Our parents, because they are a part of our team, could be involved in our action plan. We could provide resources to the parents to help work on that skill, all right? We're going to implement this plan, and then we're going to do training if needed. If a teacher needs training on how to collect data, if a teacher needs training on how to implement a plan, we provide that training, and then we assess what's going on. And what that means is we're monitoring and evaluating progress as we go through. However we've chosen to do that. And at this point, you might be able to tell that I'm being broad because there is no one right way to do it, okay? It's just about doing these steps, okay? And then we get back to gather data, all right? So at this point, we're looking at the outcome data that we've collected, all right? That's our simple process. I like to break it down into 4 steps, just like that. You gather data, you define your problem. If you need more data, you collect more data. You try to simplify the problem, get down to the basis, okay? You develop an action plan that includes objectives, okay? And also data collection procedures, goals, what are we working towards? all right? You enact change, and then you analyze your data. This is an ongoing process. If you collect your data as you're going through your change procedure and things are going good and the kid's learning his multiplication facts and making progress, then you celebrate that success and you continue doing what you're doing. However, if you're collecting data and he's not making progress in those skills, that's where you get into a problem-solving process, okay? When you look at this outcome data, you want to graph and share it, okay? You also want to celebrate the progress. Now, from here, now that you've seen the process, I'll kind of talk about some of the keys to it and some of the pitfalls. And James mentioned this earlier. A lot of the times when I'm brought in as an independent evaluator to do a process like this, there's really a breakdown in communication, all right? And this is a great way to solve that breakdown, to get a very objective measure out in front of us to evaluate a student's progress, okay? So my 5 keys here are keep data collection simple, collect data often, graph and interpret that data, sharing and communication of the data, and then problem solving, lack of process. We're going to walk through each one of these quickly, but in my experience and what we do in the clinic and also what I've done in the schools, these are the 5 things that have to be done, okay? And usually when there's a breakdown or parents aren't satisfied with services or don't feel like their child's making progress and the school district's saying, well, they are making progress, usually one of these steps is missing. And to be completely honest, a lot of times I'll come into situations where there is a lot of data that's been collected. Sometimes it's pretty simple, sometimes it's complex, but most often it's not graphed or interpreted in real time. It's collected, it's put in a binder, it's brought out at the next IEP meeting, it's used to fill out a progress monitoring sheet, and it's also not shared and communicated with the parents in a way that they can interpret it and feel comfortable. And if we're not doing the graphing, the sharing, we can't problem solve lack of progress and make changes, okay? And that's really an additional key is problem solving, lack of progress. Making changes when you see the data is saying a student's not making progress in an area. All right, so let's break each one down. Keep data simple. All right, to do so, this starts with simple and measurable goals. IDEA does not always allow us to make simple and measurable goals. A lot of times when I read a goal, it's actually 3 or 4 goals in one, okay? If that's the case and you have to have that goal, break that goal down and figure out how you're going to measure each individual area, okay? If it's not a student in special education, you can still write goals that are measurable, all right? Utilize fluency measurement. This is something that has been, I have found to be novel in some situations. Elementary teachers are very used to this, but middle school, high school, I see it not as often. Fluency measurement is timed measurement. Okay, so our student that had the deficit in math skills, multiplication and division, you could set up a simple probe. You can find so much online to make math worksheets, right? And then you see how many problems he can complete in a minute or 3 minutes, okay? And you analyze, let's say they completed 5 problems the first time we did the assessment, right? Now, keeping your data simple means that's how we're going to monitor his progress. We're going to create novel probes using the same type of problems, multiplication and division problems at the same level, but we're going to keep that timing the same. And we're going to see if his fluency increases. And what you'll see as mistakes go down and a kid becomes more proficient in a skill, fluency increases. Okay? Is that making sense? Are there nods out there? Okay? That's why I love fluency measurement. Okay? Oral reading fluency is probably the most common that people see fluency measurement with. Words read correctly in 1 minute, okay, on a grade level passage. Select objective forms of measurement, okay? So many times you see on an IEP, how are we going to measure this goal? Observation, right? We're going to observe the student. That's not as an objective as fluency measurement, okay? You can do rather objective observations, but I always in terms of having effective communication and communicating students' progress, using fluency measurement and numbers and standardized measures often create better communication and more trust. When I say standardized measures, and I mean things like rating scales, like the BASC rating scale, the behavior assessment scale for children. There are social skills improvement scales that are standardized. Pretty much in any diagnosis area, there are standardized measurements. And a lot of people aren't aware, I wasn't aware until I got specific training on the BASC for this, that those can be used to monitor progress. They're not as sensitive as a 1-minute time probed. They're not meant to be used every week. And we'll get into that as one of the keys here. But they can be used to monitor progress. I use them and recommend them all the time for parents that have concerns regarding social skills or social integration, right? Do an initial behavior rating scale or social skills rating scale. Pick out areas to intervene and instruct in. 3 months later, come back and have the same people do the scale again. It is sensitive enough to show you that, and it graphs it for you, and then you can sit at a meeting and put both down and see if there's progress or not. Okay? Keep it organized. That takes a lot of effort. Takes a lot of setup from the beginning. I recommend binders. I recommend printing off things all at once and keeping it organized. You give the assessment, you put it back in the binder, and you put it in, if you're going to use Excel to graph it, you put it in Excel right away. All right? Many times I've been handed a binder as an independent evaluator that has 100, 150 data probes in it, not even in the right order. None of them have been graphed, and it takes hours, if not entire days, to organize it all. Whereas if someone had taken 5 minutes each week, it would be there, right? And then it could be interpreted, and then it could be used to monitor progress and make changes, okay? Collect data often, all right? And there is no hard rule for this. I say match the frequency of data collection to the measure being used and the severity of the concern. So 2 things there, measure being used. If you're using a fluency probe for math, let's say you've created one for the multiplication and the division, that's something that could be administered every week. You set it timed for 1 minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever you think is appropriate for the child. You can do that on every Friday. You could also do it every 3rd week, okay? Severity of concern, the more severe and the farther behind the child is in an area, the more often you need to progress monitor. All right, so if I got a kid in math that's sitting at the 1st to 5th percentile, which is way below average, I'm going to recommend monitoring their progress every week for at least 5 to 10 weeks until we start to see that progress grow, and then we might back off and do it every 3rd week. The research would tell you the difference between 2, 3, 4 weeks is minimal, but 1 versus 3 weeks is significant, okay? So what are we looking at? 1 time per week, once per 3 weeks, once per 9 weeks, 3 times a year, okay? If you're using something like a behavior rating scale, a standardized measure that's not as sensitive, once per 9 weeks or 3 times a year is as much as you're going to want to do it, right? If you're looking at a not too severe of a concern, maybe a student's just a little bit behind, and you just want to monitor to make sure that they're catching up, maybe once per 3 weeks, okay? But those are the typical ones I go with, never more than once a week. Okay, make sense so far? Question? I love questions.
Can we do that?
Yeah, please.
Say the behavior is an aggressive behavior in school, and you want to get change immediately.
Great question.
Okay?
Yeah.
Well, you're told by the people at the school that they have to collect 90 days of data.
Mm-hmm.
What can you do to change that? Because you're scared to death the kid's gonna be taken out of that typical school and placed somewhere else, and you can't get anybody to listen to your concern, they're just ticking stuff off.
Yeah, that's a great question and prompted something that I had forgotten to say. Severity of concern there, right? Problem behavior. I call it furniture movers, right? People that are destructing rooms, kids that are destructing rooms, or violent behavior. You're taking data every day. You're taking data every minute of the day. And in that case, it's frequency data, right? Those are really severe concerns that I deal with occasionally writing functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. And when it's really involved like that, I'll recommend, real-time data collection. We call it either event recording or frequency occurring, like the number of times a child's engaging in a behavior. That makes it more complicated because then you have more data, right? You're probably measuring more things, and it requires more help and assistance from specialists or people rather, outside the classroom to help you graph that data and interpret that data.
But you want that immediate help, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
How can you, why wouldn't they go ahead and contact someone like you or like Learning Tree or someone like that and?
We love it when they
We
do.
need you in here now, we don't,
Yeah, and that happens.
busting rooms up and chairs and hitting kids and biting and spitting.
Yep. And we do have situations like that. We do have a lot of very proactive situations that I work in where districts have utilized their resources and call in extra help. I don't know which district you're speaking of, but that is something that we do as educational consultants. Yeah.
And it typically takes 90 days to get help in there or evaluations or?
Not necessarily.
Okay. Well, that's what I was
Yeah,
concerned.
not necessarily. I've been called in ahead of time. They know kids are coming and they'll call us in to help them set up the environment. Yeah.
But there's no written thing that says that it has to be.
I don't, that's not a question I can answer. I don't know exactly where you're going, but yes, I think what I can take from your question and really apply to what I'm speaking of here is that the frequency of data collection needs to be matched to the severity of the concern. And not having to wait is definitely an issue. These are things that you can do while you're waiting, right? Take that data so you come to the team with lots of data to analyze the problem and get the help you need, right? Graphing and interpretation, all right? Always graph the data and don't rely on charts and scales, okay? Interpret data often as a team, all right? And that's a team decision based on the severity of the problem and the complexity of the problem. Do we need to monitor data every 5 weeks? Who's in charge of monitoring that data? Who's in charge of collecting it and graphing it? And then once those decisions are made, that's part of phase 2 when you develop your treatment plan, or phase 3 when you develop your treatment plan or your intervention plan. You're deciding how often do we need to come and look at this. Rule of thumb is you can't really get a trend in data without at least 3 data points, right? So if you're saying we're going to collect data every week, then you got to wait at least 3 weeks to see if you have a trend there. I'd recommend 5 before you see a real consistent trend. So that might change how frequently and often you want to collect data. If you've got a big concern, a severe concern, and you want to know if what you're doing is working, you need to collect data every week. All right, and celebrate success. Sometimes we forget to do that and send those graphs home to parents, right? We've got a real organized system running here, and we forget to tell the parents about the success, and we only call them when the graph's below what we want it to be. So here's my example. Let's look at oral reading fluency. All right, we got a 2nd grade student, and my question is, are they making adequate progress? We decided to progress monitor them once a week, and this is our chart from the beginning of August through October. Who thinks they're making progress? I can tell you just off the top of my head that a 2nd grade student using this measure should be growing about 1.31 words per week. All right, so you can set a trend line there. But looking at that chart, it looks pretty good, right? Right? Anybody notice that there's dates missing? Yeah. It takes a lot more. Is that easier to look at? Do you think the kid was making as much progress now? That red line is that 1.31 words per week from where they started to where they need to go just through October. Now you can make a graph for a whole year and see where they'll end up at the end of the year. This shows you where you missed your data collection, right? And that's not the end of the world. The kid could have been sick. You could have been sick. Could have ran out of time. But what this says to me is right around between 9:17 and 9:24, the students really kind of plateaued, right? So what are we doing? Why has the student plateaued? That would be my discussion. Now, if you didn't look at this and you didn't graph this data until December when you had to send home your progress report, would you have made any changes? No. If you look at it, let's say we agreed to look at it every 5 weeks, and we're at, let's pretend there's one more data point. We're at the 10th week. Would you maybe consider making a change? Yeah, and that change doesn't have to be turning the kid's world upside down. It could be, let's add 5 extra minutes. Let's look at our data again. We're collecting data on the implementation of our intervention, right? And we're doing our reading intervention at 8:15 in the morning, and he shows up late to school a lot. We could make as simple of a change as let's move that intervention to the afternoon, monitor progress for 5 more weeks, and see if he catches up. What if that's all it took, right? Doesn't mean, oh no, the curriculum's not working. Oh no, the teaching's not good. Maybe we say, okay, the kid has a lot of trouble paying attention, right? He's really struggling. He's in this group. Well, who's in the group with him? Well, his best friend's in the group. Well, can we change that? The answer may be no, but it's a very simple solution that you would have never addressed if you weren't looking at your data, right? You just would have continued on. And 9 times out of 10, when I'm brought in, that data has never been graphed. And if it has been graphed, it's never been looked at as a team with parents, okay? This doesn't even, when I worked for Charleston County School District, we would be looking at this data as a team and bring in parents when we wanted to make big decisions about it, right? If a kid wasn't making progress and I sat down and saw this, it'd be, hey, let's bring the parent in. We need to talk about this, right? Sharing and communication. All right, decide as a team how often and what to share, all right? And that team includes the parents. How often do the parents want to see the data? What's going to make them comfortable, okay? The first few times you share data with parents, you need to sit down and share it with them, right? Once they get fluent in how to interpret it, you can send it home, all right? Share data that's easy to interpret and objective. If you were a parent, would you rather see the graph or the chart? I'd rather see the chart, or the graph. Yeah, I'd rather see the graph. All right, when data indicates need to problem solve, you need to have official meetings, IEP meetings, problem solving team meetings, and you need to communicate up front about the limitations of data collection. Okay, if students are absent, this is one piece of data. I always throw that out there. This is just one piece of data. We're not making an IEP decision in terms of qualifying or not qualifying a student based on this one fluency graph. Okay, those are limitations. Just because the student's not making progress doesn't mean we're not trying hard. Okay? And that's where problem solving comes in. And I used to always tell my teachers when I worked for the public school, and I still tell schools this now, as long as we're problem solving and looking at our data and making a good faith effort, we're going to be able to work as a team for the benefit of the child. Okay? If we don't problem solve, that's where we're going to start having issues. Okay, and I've given you a couple simple examples. What's appropriate progress? Okay, that's for a team to decide. Some skills like oral reading fluency, some basic math fluency, standardized measures like the BAS, the SSI, the social skills improvement systems, things like that have built in what is appropriate progress, right? But that's also something that a team can decide. And you base that off how far behind is this kid right now, this student right now. If they're a year and a half behind, they need to make a year and a half worth of progress to catch them up, right? So that's how I would assess appropriate progress for that kid, because we're providing additional services, right? This isn't just we're providing the base so they should make a year progress. We're doing extra and we're problem solving, so we need above extra growth if we're going to catch them up, all right? Define and agree upon this up front and as a team. Make sure the parents know. Improve your communication, right? Throw that graph out there at the beginning with that rate of improvement line on there so the parents know what to expect. Problem solve, don't complain, right? Take your data, put it on the table when you're meeting, and problem solve the situation. Don't complain about the situation, all right? Used to spend a ton of effort the first few times I do this with a team to get away from complaining about the attention or the attendance or the time they have. Let's not complain about it. Let's problem solve it and figure out the simplest solution. All right? Always make the necessary changes. If you think there's a change that needs to be made and you're not making progress, you need to make that change, or at least make the best effort to make that change. And the principle of parsimony. Prove that the most simple explanation doesn't improve performance. Didn't say that appropriate. Okay. You prove that the most simple change doesn't work first. All right, the kid's not making progress. Oh no, let's go get a new curriculum. He needs a new teacher. He needs a whole new time slot. No, problem solve, pick the simplest possible problem and fix that first, and then continue monitoring progress. And if they all of a sudden start showing progress, wow, that was easy, right? Rather than having to just flip everything upside down. Make sense? 5 keys, there they are. Keep data collection simple, collect data often, graph and interpret, share and communicate, problem solve, lack of progress. If you can do those 5 things within that framework of the database decision making, you will be on track. Improving communication, promoting a team approach, objective versus subjective, you increase trust, you decrease confusion and frustration, and you keep the focus on the child. It's amazing the look on people's faces that first time you throw that graph down in an IEP meeting, and the way it changes the communication from he said, she said, he's not making progress, I don't think he's making progress. Nobody can argue with the data that's sitting there in front of you. Any questions? Thank you.